So we're going to pin the collar to the neckline, and just make sure you can still see your notches very clearly. So this is your center back of the collar and the center back of the garment, shoulder, which aligns to this notch. And then you have got another notch on the under collar, which will align to the front placket. But what we've done is we've put 2 pins in, we've opened out the placket and we've put 2 pins in on 1 centimeter. There's a centimeter. Because when you place the edge of the collar here, it's very important that both sides are exactly the same. So it's 1 centimeter from the seam and 1 centimeter from the seam. So what you're going to do first is you're going to make sure you've got the top collar facing up, and you're going to pin the center back edges together. Then you're going to come across to your shoulder and just make sure that your seam of the shoulder seam is still facing in towards the back neck. I'm going to place a pin there. And then we'll do the other shoulder and we'll work on the one side to show you. All right, so that notch that we have on the under collar should align 1 centimeter from that edge, but it's more important that you use the pins as a guide, because sometimes this notch can be misaligned if the fabric is moved, or maybe you've lost it through pressing. So align the edge of the collar next to that pin and make sure that your raw edges are aligning. Pop it in that way. And then you can come across to this other side and repeat. So when you compare the 2 placket edges and the collar, you want to make sure that the collars are starting in the exact same position on both sides. And if you want to be 100% sure here, you can stitch 5 millimeters from the edge. You can use these basting stitches as a guide, or 5 millimeters from the edge. You can stitch from the pin about 1.5 centimeters. Then you can come across to this side and repeat, and then double check that they are accurate. And then you can go in and sew the whole neckline, the collar to the neckline.
We've just stitched the front section of the collar just to show you that this is what we meant, that then you're making sure that that's going to be a perfect collar, as you can see there. And if it wasn't, that you can readjust it. So we've now machined in the collar, and we're just going to turn that over, and you can see, just checking that nothing's been caught, and you can see that the seams are beautifully facing the back of the bib shirt. So then we're going to now move on to the placket area. So a little tip is pop a pin in that pressed fold that we pressed on the placket, and then this is being folded over the right sides together, and that pin will help you align where it's folding over. We'll take the pin out and place it back in, and then you can see what we're doing is we're mirroring. You can see from the back to the front, we're mirroring that fold and placing a pin there, so you can see, and you're going to repeat on the other side.
You don't need to pin the bottom or the rest of the placket. So we're only working on this section here, and you're going to stitch, pin on the other side, and then stitch 1 centimeter from there to there, just to the edge of the placket, and then repeat on the other side and double check that they're both the same. So you've just stitched across the placket using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And just to be clear, the image that's in the instruction book is a bit more exaggerated, because we're showing you that was the previous stitching line, which is this, which was 5 millimeters, and then now it's 1 centimeter. So if yours looks more like ours and less like the picture, that's fine. The most important thing to focus on here is that this is a centimeter, this is a centimeter across here. And when you had sewn this in the previous step, that was 5 mm. When you stitch the binding in the next step, you're stitching the binding a centimetre, which will cover these stitches and will join up with these stitches here. So just make sure that this is definitely 1 centimetre. Once that's been stitched on both sides, you can turn it through to the right side. Turn your little piece through to the right side and then bring it across to the other side. Lay them on top of each other. So there, like that. And then bring your collars and double check that everything is perfectly symmetrical. This is a good point to fix things if they're not. So you can always go back in and make some adjustments. But to be able to sew the binding in, this needs to be turned back to this view. So turn them back through once you're happy with them. And this is the view that you need to be in to sew the binding in the next step.
This next step, we are attaching the binding to the collar, but to prepare to do that, we need to fold our wrong sides together, and we're popping our outer raw edges and we're pressing that. As you can see, that's a lovely folded bias binding. We now then need to find our middle. So we're going to pop our two outer edges together and place a pin. So that's our middle of our binding. You should still have your notch there in the middle of your back of your collar. So we're then going to place that pin to the notch.
It's really important to note that you are, when you're pinning this, you are keeping both fabrics together. A lot of people, when they're doing binding, would assume that you would open that out and stitch that first. But for this particular binding, you're keeping the fabric together. So that is creating the binding piece, which folds over to the other side.
Yes, yeah. So then the next bit, we're then going to, now don't stretch this binding. It's not stretching it, but you're placing all the raw edges together and placing some pins all the way along. Now the nature, what will happen, and every fabric will be slightly different, and we have left this on purpose to show you, because our fabric, even though we cut it exactly to the pattern, you can see how much this is stretched, and so we are going to cut a little bit of that off. Now it says 5 mil, okay, and it's going to sit basically in the middle of that placket there. So I'm going to, you can actually, you know, pop a pin to make sure you're not cutting too much, or do a marker pen, but I'm going to cut that extra off there, you can see. So it's just bypassing that folded edge there, and it's sitting in the middle of the placket. Take that pin out and place a pin back inside, and you're then going to repeat on the other side. We're now ready to machine our bias binding to our collar. Now you can use the 1 centimetre seam allowance on your plate of your machine, but just as a little extra, if you wanted to, you can put a fabric marker pen of a 1 centimetre, so you have more of a visual of what you're actually sewing, even though we say in the instructions you can use your plate. So you can use both now. So now we're going to do a locking stitch, and just be a bit aware that you see that pin is holding that bias binding, but also I'm using my fingers here to hold the bias binding in place. And I've got that lovely orange marker there, but also my guide of my 1 centimetre. So you're using both of them at the same time. And we're going to machine from one side to the other. So just make sure that nothing's getting caught underneath the bias binding.
It's so good to stop and work on little bits at a time here, because you'll be more accurate.
Definitely.
It's not about getting it done quickly. It's just about really slowing down using the guides on the machine and taking your pins out and using your marker guides. I would say the guide on the machine is the most accurate, so as long as you're lining that fabric up against that marker. But some needle plates, some plates on machines aren't as clear, so then you can refer to your guides that you have used your fabric marker with.
And just make sure, you see, even though that could quite easily just catch, so just keep checking all the time, and you can feel it with the top of your fingers as well as you're coming round and moving the garment out the way. At the end. And we don't machine over pins. So to the end and then backward stitch. So this is already finished now, lovely and machined. And just a little, what I did is after I just gave it a gentle little press just on that outer edge, just a little gentle press, that's all, before we go on to the next step of trimming this down to a 5mm. Now just take your time, and you're going kind of in the middle here, some nice sharp scissors, and just make sure that nothing is caught underneath, and you're cutting it down to a 5mm all the way along.
If someone wants to draw 5mm from the seam line, you could draw some little dots, just so that your eye has something to kind of guide the scissors towards.
Yeah, that's a good tip. It's obviously a little bit it's a little bit thicker on the seam, so you might have to, you know, I'm lifting that up, but I've got my fingers underneath, so I'm making sure I'm not cutting anything I shouldn't. And then go all the way to the edge. You do need sharp scissors for this technique. There. So this is where we're now doing the understitching of the bias binding, and you can see there that's what we've cut off, and then we're turning the bias over and the seam is going towards the right, and you can place some pins in. You don't, you know, it depends what you prefer, so we're just placing some pins there, and it's obviously holding that cut 5mm seam. I've pinned the rest of the bias binding, but we're going to now do the understitching. So it's very close to that seam edge. And then we're going to do a locking stitch, take that pin out, and we're going to hold on to those tails again at the back. And then we're going to go backwards. And then you can see my finger is still holding, even though the pins are holding that 5mm seam, I'm also still working with that bias binding seam.
And we haven't pressed that seam over before we're sewing, because the pressing can create little folds.
Exactly.
So it's better to use your fingers to push the binding to the right.
Yes.
And not press this part before you start sewing.
Yes. So I'm just going to machine all the way to the middle, but you will carry on all the way to the other end of the bias binding. We're just showing you this part here. And what I can do is, if I just stop here, and if I take that out, I can show you what it's looking like. So the next step is now that we're pressing the bias binding. Now your natural instinct maybe is to press it from this side, but you could get a horrible little crease on that seam. So we're asking you to turn this over, and so you've got it on the back of the collar here. Now you don't want to have your iron too hot, and you're just using the tip of the iron. You're doing it very gently. Can you see there? And it's just a little nice little press. Can you see there how nicely that's pressing? So you're not getting any, so you can see I'm pulling this back, pulling that, opening that seam out. But as I turn that over, you can see that the bias is coming down. You can see how nicely that's pressing, but don't over press it, don't overstretch the collar. You're just using the tip of the iron and pressing it from one side to the other. So we've turned it to the wrong side of the garment, and we're now going to place our pins holding our bias binding down. When you come to actually machine this next technique, you do need to move this placket out the way, and you could place a pin there because we will be starting our machining from where that seam is there. You're not sewing on the placket part. So you're going to pop some pins in like this. And obviously sometimes, even though we've cut that, you can see you've got some fraying. It's the nature of the fabric. So if there is lots of fraying with your fabric, either trim that off or just poke it underneath the bias binding. So carry on pinning from one side to the other. There you can see I'm just poking all that fraying back in again, and carry on pinning your bias from the one side to the other. So now we can start stitching our bias binding, and so I'm just going to move this pin a little bit out the way so the pin isn't underneath the foot. So you will start stitching from where this stitching line is there. You're not actually stitching on the placket, so it's a little bit tricky. And I'm going to place my foot down, and I'm placing my needle down just before the placket, and we're going to hold on to those tails again at the back, and we're going to go forwards and backwards. If you do have a machine that has, I'm doing the forwards and backwards, but sometimes if you have a stitching that the needle goes up and down, you could use that motion if you prefer, but some people don't have that. So, and that's like a locking stitch. So for the purpose of this video, we are using cream thread at the top of the machine and the bobbin, so you could see our stitching when we turn this over. Now your machining is just catching, it's pretty much the same distance where I stitch the binding. You're stitching just on the lower edge of that folded part of the bias binding. Now it doesn't matter if you're nervous, if it came up a little bit, it's fine. You have to do what's best for you. It's all a learning with, you know, stitching bias. So I'm going to stitch all the way to the middle, and then I'll move the binding out the way, and you can see how close it is to the edge. So just again, it's very gentle. You don't need to be in a rush, and you can see all those little frayed edges. You just poke them underneath, and can you see my fingers are very much in control of this binding, as well as the pins. So I'm going to stitch to the middle, and then I'm going to leave my needle down, and I'm going to swing this round so you can see what the finished looks like. So we've now come to the second shoulder, and we're just going to finish off the binding of the end here. So we're going to carry on. Again, we've got our fingers holding the binding, and we have one pin there left. We're going to take that out. So as I move there, we've still got that pin holding that placket out of the way, and you've just got to be really gentle as you're coming up, because we're only stitching up to. Now I'm going to actually leave my foot off the pedal, and I'm actually going to maneuver with the dial at the side of the machine, and then I'm going to go backwards. I left the needle in, and then I'm going to go backwards and then take that out, and then I'll show you. Just turn that over. You can see it's literally stopped exactly before the placket. This is the bias binding machined now and finished for you to see. And I'm going to fold over the collar. Now, we would normally have used a matching thread to the green fabric, but we've left it cream for you to visually see it on the film.